Israel is coming out of Egypt, ready to be delivered from Egypt. We've commented on how God took the family down there, 70 to 75. There's a couple of different numbers given in different places depending on how you count them. Joseph was already there, so he's not counted in one place. And so from this, it's a large family, but still insignificant with regard to what it is required for there to be a nation. And so God has carefully protected this family, this descendant of Abraham, so that when they were numerous enough, God would bring them out and they would become a nation. They would still be an identifiable people. And so basically they were I call it a homogeneous people. That is a one-raced, one-lineaged people. Now it didn't mean that there weren't some Egyptians that came out with them. There's some indication that there was. But they were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. And so this in itself has been a most interesting and unique occurrence, and there are several texts throughout Scripture that indicate how God, this was His special nation among all the nations. And Acts 17 tells us that God is responsible for the creation and times and places of all the nations, not just the nation of Israel. But this is a special creation, this nation. And so as they come out of Egypt, they are going to be constituted as a nation, and that's what we want to look at today. We will come to this again in a fuller sense in Deuteronomy, but I'll introduce the whole concept today because it is evident in Exodus as well. The next thing we have after the provision of a deliverer, and we would be on about page 44 of your notes, I believe. Moses being born, protected, he leaves, he comes back, God instructs him as to what he is to do. He reveals to him his own name, the name Yahweh, the I am or I will be. And there's debate as to what the verb to be is to signify with regard to changing it into a name, a personal name. It's not a title, it's actually his name. And so I am, some would say he's the self-existent one, the one from eternity. But there's some indication that it's a future tense, I will be whom I will be, or I will be, and it may, and one interesting suggestion I've seen more recently is the idea that perhaps it is I will be there. Wherever you are, I will be. Sort of like when we say, I'll be there for you. It's a promise that, of our personal commitment, of our intention to, be your friend, to never leave you, to never abandon you. And all of those are certainly true, but God is revealing more than just a title by which He is to be called. He is revealing something of the essence of His person, specifically with regard to His relationship to Israel. And so it is designed to encourage the people who are in Egypt, who have a sense, some sense of who they were, where they came from, what their history is, their differentness, their uniqueness from the Egyptians, but nonetheless who would need encouragement, who would need exhortation, who would need a reason to leave. Even though our life is hard here, at least we know what we've got. What do we have in Canaan waiting for us? And we find out later on there's some unpleasant things there, giants and stuff like that. And so the essence of what Moses has to encourage them with is nothing less than the person of the eternal Creator God, who is there and will be there for His people. And ultimately, he is the one who brings the people out. And so we see in this next section in Exodus, in chapters 5 to 13, that God doesn't simply leave it up to the people to choose him. He sets up this whole scenario whereby they're eventually booted out of the nation, and in some respects against the people's wishes. And so we come into this period where Moses and Aaron come and they announce to Pharaoh that he is to let Israel go, and Pharaoh hardens his heart and he says no, and then God brings this series of plagues. And so at one point the people even say, Moses, let up. We don't want this. Forget it. We'll stay here. This is getting too hard. And yet God is not going to let that happen. And so he provokes the oppression in one sense. Now, Pharaoh was an unbeliever. Pharaoh had already sealed himself in unbelief. But even unbelievers aren't totally stupid. And when bad things happen and you know where they're coming from and you'd like them to stop, even an unbeliever can be smart enough to stop it. And yet Pharaoh doesn't. And the contributing factor to that is that God just hardened him in his unbelief so he would act even more stupidly. And the design is so that Israel would be just expelled from the land. And it would be a decisive and a final expulsion. And so we see here the provocation of the oppressor. The Pharaoh is oppressing the nation of Israel, and he is going to be provoked by God, and that's what these plagues eventually do, to say, leave, get out of here. And then, of course, he'll have another change of heart and go after them, and God will destroy him at the Red Sea. So the plagues are designed to do two things. First of all, they're designed to show the Lord's supremacy. And it does say in your reading, in your text, that he is greater than the gods of Egypt. And these plagues were against a number of the gods. They occur in regard to phenomenon and symbols of a number of the gods of Egypt. They had far more gods than 10. But these plagues were for one purpose, to show that God is the supreme God of the universe. And the other purpose was to provoke Pharaoh into not just allowing the children of Israel to go. Because if it had been nice, if it had been equitable, if Pharaoh had said, well, that's fine. If you want to go, go. If you want to stay, stay. And we'll set up a retirement system for you, and we'll treat you nice. And those who want to stay, you're welcome to stay. And we won't afflict you anymore because your numbers will be few, won't matter. If he'd have done that, a lot of them might have stayed. But the way God works it out, none of them stayed. They had to leave. They would have been terrified to stay, and just in terms of the fear of reprisal for what God had done to Egypt. And so these plagues, culminating in the Passover, culminating in the plague of the death of the firstborn, do these two things. They show truly who Yahweh is with regard to the gods, the supposed gods of the nations. And these gods weren't just fabrications. There was undoubtedly a demon activity behind much of this. We see some of this in the references to magic in Egypt. And to provoke Pharaoh to expel the people. The Passover, as the part of the 10th plague, had a dual purpose. First of all, it was a judgment. It was a judgment on the firstborn of all Egypt. Actually, the firstborn of all who would not apply blood to the doorposts of the house, in accordance with the instruction of Moses, the instruction of the Lord. But it was the final act of judgment. We had find in the text, as you read, that Israel was God's firstborn son. We see that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22. and 23, where Moses is told to go and to say to Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn. And so God makes a threat against Pharaoh. And this threat is carried out in the 10th plague, in the plague of the death angel passing through and killing the firstborn of man and beast, I believe it says. And so it is a judgment. It's a judgment against Pharaoh. It's a judgment as an act of unbelief. It's a judgment of the nation of Israel beyond just general unbelief for the way they had treated the descendants of Abraham. What does that bring to mind? Verse. Remember a verse? Huh? Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And so this is an outworking of that pronouncement of God, that the Abraham and his descendants would be those who would have a special place in God's favor, a special place in His heart. Later on, they're called the apple of His eye, and that refers to the pupil. Okay, you can touch the white of your eye. If you've never tried that, go ahead. It doesn't bother you at all. Try to touch the pupil if you don't have a contact on. It hurts. How many of you wear contacts and you've ever scratched your cornea by dirty contacts or improper contacts? There are few things more painful in the body than a scratched cornea, and I've had a couple of them in my time, about your age. Awful. It hurts. So, you know, the image there is that to harm the descendants of Abraham is like to take a pin and scratch around on the cornea of God's eye. Do you want to do that? No. You don't want to do that. And so that's the image. And so God is bringing judgment against the Egyptians for their unbelief, but also for their hostility against this most privileged people and this special people. And so it's a judgment. It's also a redemption. It's a redemption by blood. It's a redemption through the application of the blood of the Passover lamb. And the Passover will become a yearly festival of Israel's that's instituted to remind them of this event, but also to remind them of the necessity of the application of blood in order to avoid the eternal judgment of God. And so the plagues in the Passover, as the 10th plague, serve this most important function of preparing of the final straw, if you will, the pile of affliction to the Egyptians that will prompt the nation and prompt the Egyptians to expel the nation of Israel. So chapters 5 to 13 have a lot of interesting things in them with regard to the plagues, but that's the general overall purpose of what is going on here. We next have the destruction of the pursuer. The destruction of the pursuer. And of course we know the account of how the nation leaves. They come to, under the direction of God, whatever route is taken, they come to a place where they are hemmed in, they are trapped. They have the sea on one side and they have Pharaoh and his armies on the other. And God directs Moses in delivering them. The sea is parted and the Israelites pass through unharmed, and as the Egyptian army follows, they are drowned in 6 inches of water, according to one theory of the Red Sea crossing, which does not make a whole lot of sense. You know, that's the theory where you can explain it by just natural phenomenon, the anti-miraculous approach to the Bible, that this wind came and kind of, blew the water back, and then, they just went across, and it's just something that happens every now and then in that part of the world. in which case the whole Egyptian army drowned in 6 inches of water, which is more fantastic than what it's supposed to explain non-fantastically. It was a deep body of water, and so we see the destruction of the pursuer. Again, the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, I don't know, I think I'm going back to Red Sea. It's a judgment. It's a judgment against Pharaoh. Pharaoh continues to show his absolute hostility and his utter disdain for Yahweh and for His people, even with all of the evidence, even with all of the miracles, even with all of the indications of who He is and who the Lord is and who Pharaoh, his own impotence. You see, it's not evidence that is at the heart of man's problem of alienation with God. It's just a heart of unbelief. And for some people, there is no amount of evidence. There's no amount of testimony that will overcome their unbelief. And we see that with Pharaoh. So the Red Sea is a judgment, and it is another deliverance. It is a deliverance by power. So we've got God sparing the life of the firstborn of Israel through the Passover lamb, and that is a symbol of a larger deliverance of the firstborn, the nation as a whole, because it's the firstborn son of Yahweh, according to Exodus 4. And also a deliverance by power, where he comes, or they are delivered in this great crossing of the sea, by which then Pharaoh is destroyed. In chapter 15, we have a kind of an interlude. Let's have a song and dance. It's sort of like a musical at this point. A musical is, something where every now and then the characters break out in song and dance. That's a line from a movie, but that's something else. But you have a poetic section here intruding itself. And you will often find this in narrative sections of the Bible. As you look at the life of David, you'll be reading through Samuel, and all of a sudden there'll be a psalm, and sometimes they're actually in the book of Psalms as well. And that's important. What it is it's kind of a summary, it's a celebration, and people celebrate things in song, and it's easy to remember, recall, rehearse, review, and so that's what we find in chapter 15. I will sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider He's thrown into the sea. That's a praise chorus that some of you, maybe all of you, have sung. The Lord is my strength and song, and He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise Him, my Father's God, and I will exalt Him. Now that's true in an eternal sense. We can apply that to ourselves in a spiritual sense. But this is the context. I don't know if this next part is part of the song. Yahweh is a man of war. There's something to celebrate. How many of you have told your friends that recently? God loves you, has a wonderful plan for your life. And He's a man of war. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? God is both. The God of salvation, the God of grace and mercy, and He's a man of war when He needs to judge His enemies. Yahweh is His name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army He has cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, O Yahweh, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, has dashed the enemy in pieces. And in the greatness of your excellence, you have overthrown those who rose against you. You sent forth your wrath, which consumed them like stubble. And with the blast of your nostrils, the waters were gathered together. The flood stood upright like a heap, and the depths congealed in the heart of the sea. It's sort of like the water becomes Play-Doh or something putty. It congeals. Isn't that cool? The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be satisfied on them. I will draw my sword, and my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You in your mercy have led forth the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. The people will hear and be afraid. Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Palestina. Then the chiefs of Edom will be dismayed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling will take hold of them. All the inhabitants of Canaan will melt away. And that's what we find happens when the second generation enters the land. And if the first generation had taken this psalm to heart and to take this as a prophetic word of promise, they would not have shrunk back at Kadesh Barnea. They would have gone on in. Fear and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as a stone. Till your people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which you have made for your own dwelling. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. And then the footnote, for the horses of Pharaoh went with his chariots and his horsemen into the sea, and the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them. But the children of Israel went on dry land in the midst of the sea. So he had this great song of celebration of God's deliverance from Egypt. It was just an incredible event. And it was an event that was intended to, of course, accomplish the expulsion of Israel from Egypt, but it was an event also which was calculated to exalt and glorify God Himself, which it did, and to strike fear into the hearts of the future enemies of Israel, which it did. And we will have evidence of that when we get to the books of Numbers and Joshua and so forth. So we see this great song of celebration by which Israel can memorialize this event, by which they can be encouraged by it, by which they can be instructed for the future. And God is preparing for His people. Now, the next section is their immediate experience in the wilderness as they are out of the land of Egypt, as they have been delivered. And I think it is a lot like what you find in terms of the experience of an infant. You have a birth analogy, you have a son analogy at work here, and I think their care in the wilderness shows that Israel is utterly dependent upon the Lord as much as an infant on a newborn infant on his mother or her mother. And so we find here the provision for this infant nation in the wilderness. Israel depends totally on Yahweh like a newborn infant. For instance, for water at Marah. You know, a baby has no more chance of survival outside of the womb without care than it does in an abortion. That whole thing of the viability of a life in a womb and out of a womb and the argument of abortion is just totally silly. A baby left to itself will die of starvation. Now, it's murder after a birth, but not before. So, water, just the most basic element of life. You can live without food for a long time, some of us longer than others. That's what we have stored in various places. But not water. What is it, 3 days without water at most? And so, water is absolutely critical. And here they are, there's numerous people, and no water. And God provides for them water at Marah in chapter 15. He provides food for them. Again, there weren't Burger Kings. And if there were, imagine how many Burger Kings there would have had to been. and the tremendous logistical problem of getting all that stuff to the Burger Kings. I mean, where are you going to get the food? This is not a rich agricultural area. And so he provides food, again, miraculously in the wilderness of Sin. For leadership at Rephidim, they're going to have to meet some enemies. They're going to have to have human guidance, and God provides that for them in chapter 17. For protection against their enemies, we have protection against Amalek. And you can see how all of these do fit, in some sense, into the whole image of raising children from a very, very young age. Totally dependent. They need everything, food and water and protection and care and guidance. Now, what is happening here is that God is going to bring His people to a place where He's going to commission them with adult-type responsibilities. But they aren't ready for that yet. They aren't ready for it spiritually, and they certainly aren't ready for it physically and materially. He will care for them for 40 years in the wilderness, following the disobedience, and then He will deliver them into the land. Once they get into the land, they have responsibilities themselves. They have to plant, and they have to reap, and they have to sow, and they have to organize. But now they're more capable because of what God will bring them through. And so it's very much like the raising of a child. It's very much like growing up, growing into adulthood responsibility. And that, I think, is the image that we should keep in mind as we move into this section of Exodus. The other thing we find here is that Israel, this is B in your outline on page 45, is that Israel receives an encouraging demonstration of the purpose of its nationhood. Israel receives an encouraging demonstration of the purpose of its nationhood. This whole incident with Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, comes and he confesses that the Lord is supreme. Now, he was a priest of Midian, this guy, wasn't he? But here he is, as a result of his relationship with Moses and a result of him having come to know of this great exodus, this great miraculous deliverance from Egypt. And he comes and confesses the supremacy of God. And then he blesses Israel through advising Moses in his role. And remember again, back to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, where God tells Moses, or tells Abraham, after He says, I will bless you, and He says, and you will be a blessing. Or some take it as an imperative, you be a blessing. And so Israel, through Moses, had been and would be a blessing to Jethro. And in terms, Jethro blesses Israel. I will bless those who bless you. And he encouraged Israel by giving Moses advice as to how to deal with all the problems that people were bringing to him. He gives him some administrative counsel. And Moses takes it. And so I think we see here in this little interchange with Moses and Jethro that what God is about. This isn't a nation that's going to be isolated and live on its own and have its own gods and keep to itself and let everybody else go their way. God is going to do something through this nation that will affect the whole earth, all nations. It's going to be open, and it's going to be a test. How will nations treat my nation? And so, again, we see this goes all the way back to the promise given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. You will be a blessing to these nations. You'll be a blessing to the families of the earth. And the one who blesses you, I will bless. And so we see a little indication this is already happening, but it also is a demonstration of the purpose of their nationhood, what it is that God is going to do. I want to give you a scenario. Here's a hypothetical. Okay? There's no real answer to this. It's a hypothetical. But I want to see what you come up with. let's say that God today is going to enter into a relationship with some nation, some existing nation on the earth. I don't care what nation it is, okay? God doesn't have any relationship like this with any nation right now. But let's say that God was going to adopt a nation, some nation on earth today, whether it's the United States or some other nation. How would he go about doing it so that both the nation would understand what was going on and other nations would understand this adoptive relationship, this relationship between God as a nation's king, a nation's president? And I know you're most of you, if not all of you, are somewhat handicapped in this because you don't think in terms of kings over countries. You think of democracies and freedom and representative government and all that. And so, I mean, it's completely different than a king. But if God were going to be the king or the dictator, the absolute, controlled president of a country, and what would he do? How would he show that? Go ahead and discuss that among yourselves. See what you can come up with creatively. How would God show his distinctive relationship to one nation from all of the nations? It can't just be material, it can't just be circumstantial, or all the nations would always have to be in dire need and impoverishment and so forth, and in that case they wouldn't even survive. And only one nation, well off. But does that ever happen? Is that the world? Is that realistic? Well, no, probably not. It's an extremely interesting problem, and it's a problem that existed when Israel came out of Egypt as well. But God had set the stage to resolve that problem. And that's what we find in the next section here, with God constituting his son nation as a priest. Oh, all right. Well, it's probably the text of chapter 19. Exodus 19. Sometimes it's just fooling me when it does that once. I did it again. Exodus 19, which is the chapter right after Exodus 18, where you have Jethro and Moses. We find in the 3rd month the children of Israel, having gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai, for they had departed from Rephidim and come to the desert of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. God is at this point ready to constitute the nation, the people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's ready to constitute them as a nation. They're going to have a special purpose as a nation, but they have to have an identity as a nation. And in this one fell swoop, in this very short period of time, in this one event, completely isolated from the rest of the world, God does this. And what we find him doing is using a common form of relationship, a common political, covenantal, contractual convention that kings in the ancient Near East had used to relate themselves to their subject peoples and to their subject nations for probably already 1,000 years. And that would be like taking, and there's nothing like this around in the world today. You know, how are people related to their government? How are people related to their ruler? Well, as you look around the nations of the world, how many different ways are there? Well, there are numerous ways. And so you can't say this is how somebody would recognize a king or a ruler and people and the relationship. But in the time of Israel, it was very easy to be able to show the relationship between a ruler and his people, because there had developed, under God's careful design, a treaty format by which was regularly recognized, by which one nation could actually see and come to understand, have communicated to them the relationship between a king and his people. And that's what God is going to use. And so we find this beginning to be indicated in Exodus, and it will be fully developed in Deuteronomy. And so we'll pick it up there. But God couldn't do it today. He could not do today, in terms of establishing His headship over a nation, what He could with Israel coming out of Egypt. And we'll take a look at why.